Green Talks. Podcasty na temat transformacji energetycznej, ESG, ekologii i nowych technologii. Warto nas słuchać. A nasza dzisiejsza rozmowa odbędzie się z panem Yourim Zuyderwijk, ekonomistą z tytułem magistra Uniwersytetu w Utrechcie i konsultantem firmy doradczej Ecorys. Dzisiaj z Yourim porozmawiamy sobie o wpływie i implementacji polityk ESG w kontekście wojny na Ukrainie. Youri, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview or conversation, should I say. It's an honor to have you at our podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's really nice to have this international podcasting experience, and it's nice to have a conversation with you, of course, always, Marcel.
Thank you very much. I hope our listeners will agree that the topics we'll touch upon will be interesting. And so, let's get straight to the topics at hand. We are here to discuss the challenges of the implementation of the European Green Deal in the aftermath of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So this is obviously a very loaded topic and a topic which delves and ebbs into different aspects of what the EGD, what the European Green Deal entails and its various policies. But fundamentally, we have to admit that the curtailing of imports of energy products from Russia into Europe created a situation in which the cost of energy transition became bigger. There are some voices that say that in order to address the increase in the price and to get ahead and get on the green transition, we need to make faster strides in the area of renewable energy deployment. However, it's a question how we do this, because it's not as easy, and the costs associated with a deployment of renewables on the European scale are perhaps insurmountable given the timelines that we have within the EGD, or there are some at least that say that. And so I wanted to ask you, do you think our trajectory is well on the way to realize those goals of climate neutrality in 2050? And how do you think it's impacted by what's currently going on?
Thank you for the long introduction and a good question. I think that we as the European Union are still on the trajectory to reach the climate neutral goals of 2050 for the European Union. But I think what's clearly visible is from the sanctions and from the aftermath of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, we really show that how dependent we are on fossil fuels, and that also really pushed to the increase in prices. That also made it more expensive to have fossil fuels. And then because, for example, here in the Netherlands, we really got cut off from Russian gas, so we had to switch to worse alternatives. We had to import more coal to use coal for our coal power plants for electricity generation. And then you can clearly see that there was an increase of CO2 emission for electricity generation. And I think that was a short, really bad situation, but it was the only situation that was possible. So the Russian sanctions and the Russian invasion, it really caused us to go back to these short-term solutions to solve that there was no energy shortage in the winter of 2020 to 2023. But I believe that it also created a very good incentive to really decrease the dependency on fossil fuels, because we in Europe, we are mostly dependent from fossil fuels from outside of the European Union. Most of our natural gas or oil is produced outside the European Union, and much we got from Russia, almost half of it. And now that is completely gone or almost gone. Some countries are still a bit dependent on Russian gas. That really shows that we have to use other sources for our electricity and energy use. And I think that is also boosting and really pushing and creating incentives to use renewable energy sources. And I think that's also, maybe this can also, in the short run, this is giving a more negative impact for the climate and for the economy, because the fossil fuels we had to import last year were really expensive. We needed to buy LNG, which is quite expensive energy source from the Middle East and from the United States. And it was quite expensive. We bought it for a really, really high price, and we also saw it all in the households in our gas bills, because they increased extensively.
Right.
But on the long run, we also see, maybe we should not use as much gas for our heating because this is quite not really good for us. And then we should look at, can we fast track isolation in houses, like reduce the gas demand completely, like with much. And I think that's also what, for example, here in the Netherlands, like really big programs started to improve isolation of houses, like old houses.
Right, energy efficiency.
And energy efficiency in buildings. And I think that's one of the really important things. And that is what really actually pushed for the Russian war. So it has negative impacts in the short run, but in the long run, I think it's making us more realizing how much we are still relying on fossil fuels and how much we need to decrease it. So maybe this war was also a positive push, but then we can only see that in the future, of course.
Right. So, as you said, the war basically became a canary in a coal mine kind of situation for showing us how dependent we are on the thing that is harmful fundamentally in the long term. However, as you've also admitted, it's the short-term, medium-term cost of a fundamental transition to a more renewable, a climate neutral, for a lack of a better slogan, future is costly, and it's for countries such as the Netherlands, in which the stock or the base of energy generation from renewable sources is very high. But it's more of a challenge to countries like where I'm from Poland, from Central and Eastern Europe, which still heavily depend on fossil fuels, and even after the Russian invasion and the Russian war on Ukraine started, and so it's just a very big effort to a very big mountain to surmount in order to create a situation in which renewables, the uptake of renewables, their deployment matches the energy demand, while simultaneously not banning the poorest, the low-income citizens to poverty fundamentally, because increasing the price of energy makes work expensive, and when you make work expensive, well, it does not end well for the lowest income class, unfortunately. And so I guess we kind of fall into a moral dilemma, right? Because on the one hand, we want to decarbonize, we want to create a scenario in which we strive to a climate neutral future for the benefit of both our children and future generations. But at the same time, we kind of decide on whether or not to make a sacrifice on, at least, even if it's just the economy, it's what we're doing is we're creating mechanisms that increase prices of fossil fuel-based energy production, which on the one hand, from the perspective of reaching climate neutrality, may be exactly what we want to do. But on the other hand, this is a clear inflationary pressure factor, which drives up inflation, given that energy prices feed into mostly every consumption product we can think of. And so that's tangible. So do you see a better way of approaching the topic? Do you perhaps see a way of replicating, for example, the insulation, the thermo modernization of the Netherlands in other countries? Do you think there's a lesson to be taken from there? I
think that we as a European Union, we also have like this imbalance inside our own European Union, because we here in the Netherlands, the Northwestern, the Scandinavian countries, we are quite far advanced in our economy. So I think we should take up this leadership role of being an innovative country and creating an innovative energy system. And then we can endure that pain, sort of we can endure those costs as an economy, because we already have like so much high level of standard of welfare. We have a good running economy. We have a strong economy with many surpluses that we have. So I think that we should take up as one of the countries that also was like one of the first in other innovations in energy use. We should really take up that as showcasing that like we should have this cost of innovation, this short term cost, but then other countries in the long run can really benefit from it. What's always like really interesting is like Germany was really one of the big countries for solar panels. They really started this innovation with creating solar panels, and now China took the solar panel industry over and made them like really, really cheap. And now everybody can buy quite cheaply solar panels. And they're already predicting that the price of solar panels is going to drop another significant amount in the next 10 years. So, and that's something we in the Netherlands made really, created like big subsidy programs for offshore wind energy. Before around 2010, offshore wind energy was not really financially viable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was not sustainable to create as an energy company an offshore power wind farm on the sea because the costs were way too high. And then as the Netherlands, we created, we will pay you the gap if you create innovation that in 5 year time you will be able to create your own financially viable wind farms. And then all these different energy companies, they all came to the Netherlands like, well, if we improve this, so the Dutch consumer and the Dutch government, we paid the price. But now, for example, other countries are really able to make affordable wind energy from the sea. And I think there are all different fields of energy that we can create we can give the incentive, we can give the subsidies, we can pay the cost of innovation, and then other countries can
be the beneficiaries of that
like
first mover.
It's called
Yes.
It's a famous theory of the leaping frog theory.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of some countries like jump over phases of in technology. They are based in this old technology system. They don't have to go through this whole transition phase of trial and error.
Right.
Choosing like a transition energy. No, they go from the old immediately to the new.
Oh, yes.
So they don't have to all this cost. They just immediately implement this
process of
And I think,
innovation.
But then as part of the European Union, you become part of this group of countries that's really highly advanced, highly economically important, with high incomes. And then once you join that group, also the cost of creating more innovation is your responsibility. When you become a rich country, you also have responsibilities for the whole world to generate new innovations that other countries can really improve of. For example, in Africa, it's way more affordable now to have solar panels because we paid the price for it. So I think there are many more technologies where we should invest in more, or create frameworks or have an idea to make us bear the cost because we can handle the cost. We have like the financial the financial support to handle those costs, and then we should have those costs upon us as a society, as a government, as a total economy, and then other countries can probably profit from that. So I think this is always an interesting approach that not really everybody sees that as a rich country. You not only profit from the whole world economy, you also have responsibilities to improve the world economy and improve the world. And especially now with the climate crisis, it was a really big thing that's going on. And then we as Europe really have to put all our effort into solving that and really look at how should we best address this problem. We have to bear those costs. And then as part of Eastern European countries, when you join the European Union, you also are in that framework that is taking all those costs of innovation. So, and then I think, do you think that the Polish economy also is ready also to bear the cost of the innovation and to have the cost of the more expensive energy system that you're going to get? Or is it ready to make additional investments into products or into technologies that may not work in the future? Because you have to try, and maybe things go wrong, maybe things are right. You never know what's right. So is Poland ready to do that?
Well, I would say that we definitely have built a capacity for innovation from, let's say, the side of government support for innovation, and whether or not we're prepared to kind of buttress the impact of a radical transition right now. I don't think we are as a society. Neither do I think we have the capacity to do it fundamentally. I mean, our energy system is still based in 78%, I believe, on on fossil fuels still right now. The ecosystem around it employs a vast millions of people at each stage of the supply chain of this industry. And so what I see fundamentally as the biggest challenge, well, I think there are two. First of all, I do think, to partly answer your question, I do think that the Polish state has, and it's doing effort, it's taking efforts in order to create a strategy and remodel capital flows towards technology that's renewable in order to increase the uptake of renewable energy from renewable sources. But at the same time, I think we stumble upon 2 or 3 fundamental problems with that. First of all, as I said, a lot of people are employed in the sector that operates and is organized around fossil fuel production, energy production, both coal, but also refineries of petroleum products.
The fossil fuel industry is a really big employer for in the Polish economy and for Polish businesses.
It definitely is. And so the problem would be to reskilling basically of the workforce. That's number one, because it's not. I don't think it's a feasible timeline for, say, the Silesia region to totally transform its business model even until 2050. We just have too little time to fundamentally reschedule a region's development trajectory that's so heavily dependent on fossil fuel, on uptaking, for example, high emission energy sources such as coal. And so that's one thing. The other thing is, and that's a problem not only of the Central and Eastern European region, not only Eastern Europe, but also Western Europe, which is the capacity of the grids, of the energy grids. And so with the intermittent nature of the production profile of renewable sources, I think until we as we go and as we move towards a solution on the renewable energy front, and as we aim to increase the share of renewable energy in the energy mix of the EU as a whole, we should take into account what role will there be for energy storage that has to accompany the uptake of renewables, because that's just a solution that we have to face. We face a strained electrical grid when there's too much production. There is not enough stabilizers, as we should probably call them, because energy storage is technically not the right term, but there should be an infrastructure of energy storage units that accompany basically every PV or wind installation or any hybrid installation, because fundamentally without that we have a lot of energy production that's totally curtailed and lost, and that's a loss on the economic front, but also a loss on the energetic front, so energy front, shall I say. And so that's the second challenge. The capacity of the grid is a second challenge, which, unless we have addressed that, and we don't really fundamentally, even with the energy market design, the revision of the directive on the EU level, I don't think we fundamentally have yet tackled the root issues that we face as a society right now in terms of energy, of electrical grid capacity. So that's the second challenge that Poland and Europe as a whole must overcome. And I think the third challenge is just the price of energy generation. You said that Western Europe and the richest countries should be the first movers, the innovators, which make strides and create technologies and then proliferate the technology, making it more common, more cheap, so that other countries can profit and utilize from that. But up until that point, energy production will be both, at least from the intermittent sources, from wind, from PV, there's also geothermal. We can also talk about small modular reactors or nuclear, as it's currently defined as sustainable or transitional in the EU taxonomy as an energy production method. But those most popular renewable energy methods are intermittent, and they have their own problems. And so the cost of energy might vary greatly in their production given the supply and demand. And so that's one thing that we have to address, that intermittent production might be a problem. And whether or not the energy storage is the solution, we'll see that. So to reiterate and to kind of summarize the answer to your question, I think there's definitely space for action on the Polish front and both the Polish society and the Polish economy. I mean, the uptake of solar panels and renewable panels of wind, for example, 1.3 million Polish households are already powered by photovoltaic installations. I mean, that's given to what it was 10 years ago. It's a huge increase in the amount of renewable energy that's being produced and consumed by the Polish citizen. So there's already a reason to celebrate right now, even though the optics of the situation might say that that's not enough. We should do more, obviously. But I think the Polish state and the Polish citizens and the Polish economy are operating at close to max capacity when it comes to the transition plans and their capacity for making a fundamental change in choosing the energy source. And so I think that it's more of a question of the costs versus benefits of how we do this right now, and whether this will cost whether it's worth to make energy and electricity expensive, fueling inflation, and in turn making everyone poorer as a result, in order to achieve the hypothetical climate neutrality in 2050. I think it's an open question. What do you think?
I think, well, in the end, not everybody is becoming so much poorer or so much worse out of this whole situation, and not everybody is really drastically being affected immensely, because we're not rushing this whole transition. We're not saying we turn off all the fossil fuel power plants by tomorrow. We're not doing that at all. That would be really interesting, because then you get really the hyperinflation.
But that would just be stupid.
That would also be stupid. And also not be feasible, not be doable. We
have not in Poland.
Not in Poland. If you turn off all your coal-fired power plants,
we're done.
There's a power shortage. It's over.
Yeah,
but you're already making improvement. What you're talking about, how many homes now are already fueled by solar energy? It's It's like immense. It's good. That's like the good progress that we're on. And I think also, of course, the electricity, the energy grid is really a big problem, because they're also in politics and making policy. Not everybody is brilliant. That's also what we always see. And then for the energy grid, everybody, like the most technical people, said, well, maybe in the future we need more energy. We're going to use energy differently. Maybe we should invest in it. And then all the politicians says, no, everything works fine. We don't have to invest it. And now we learn, this electricity grid, what worked extremely well for the old system. You have like one big power supplier, like a big energy plant that supplies for everybody in the region, that just takes energy. But now everybody is giving back, giving back. Like there's a whole more interflow of how energy goes. And then it really is a task for to really, really improve the energy grid. And that's really taking a challenge. And also, we also have to think about, in this whole energy grid, how are we, because at some point here in the Netherlands, when it's winding, when the wind is blowing quite strongly and it's sunny, then the electricity prices go negatively. So you have to pay to get rid of your electricity. It's sort of that's the way how the system works. So that's how we created it. And that's like, we are getting better in predicting it. We are getting like when it's going to be what, and how should like fossil fuels power plants, because you can steer them a bit better. Because for example, with a gas power plant, you can just turn it on and then you have electricity, and you can turn it off, and then electricity is gone. So you can play a bit more with it. So we're getting better. Like, okay, tomorrow is going to be windy, so the gas power plant don't have to be turned on. But still, we have to think about, we have to store that energy, electricity somewhere. And then we really have to, and that's something where we really have to innovate in. And I think with energy, electricity storage is like a really big thing that really should become like the next thing of the future. Because now here in Utrecht, for example, there's like a project going on where your electric car can become like a neighborhood battery. So when electricity prices are negatively, your car takes energy from the electricity grid.
Right,
And when the electricity price is so high, your car gives electricity back to the neighborhood when they're to balance to balance like the network. And we have to think more about like some people here.
So your car acting as an energy storage fundamentally.
Yeah, your car is acting as energy storage.
Yes, okay, yeah.
So you can sort of say to the car, well, this car I don't need it for the whole night. You can act as an energy balancer for the electricity grid. So to take off some loads of the electricity grid, to have like to be more active in that.
Right.
And I think with people also going to install like what we're seeing more often here in the Netherlands, people installing home batteries at home to also make sure that when they have solar panels, they can charge their batteries or they can give back to the electricity grid based on how the grid situation is then. And I think we have to think more and more about that. And maybe also when we have big wind farms, maybe we can look at selecting, maybe transforming hydrogen at sea. It's also a big project that's maybe taking on. It's still in the project phase. It's in the North Sea. It's on the border of the German, the Danish, and the Dutch part of the North Sea. They want to build an energy island. And on that island, they want to bring all the electricity, all the wind farms with electricity cables to that island. And when there is too much supply of wind electricity, then at that energy island, they're going to transform the wind energy into hydrogen, sort of as hydrogen as a energy storage.
Energy storage, right?
You lose much energy currently when you change from electricity to hydrogen back to electricity. It's not working perfectly, of course, but this is some of the innovation that is really promising, and it can be a solution. And I think this is quite interesting that we are going to figure out how does this work? Can this work for us? And maybe this is really, really interesting.
Yeah. No, definitely. You've touched upon two things which I want to refer to. Okay. First of all, you've touched upon the hydrogen as an asset right now, but also its utilization as an energy storage method. So my first question to that would be, how do you see hydrogen as an asset in the transition efforts?
I think hydrogen if we're really, really going to get hydrogen as like immense potential. Like the potential of using hydrogen is huge. It's like so big because it's clean energy when you burn it, because hydrogen you have to burn it, and then the only thing you get out of it is oxygen and water.
Right. Yes.
So it's an amazing product for you to use in a power plant or somewhere else, maybe in planes, maybe in trucks, maybe in trains.
Right. Transportation, energy intensive.
And energy intensive industries. Yes. They can really benefit from hydrogen because then it cleans up their production so much. Right. But the hydrogen production, that's such a challenge. And also because politicians,
even though it's such a common element, basically around us, right?
It's really like the way to make is quite easily because you just need like the basic elements of this world.
Right.
And it's all around us. But then nobody really understands like what to do for it and then how to use it correctly. And I think if we just get like 1 or 2 steps further in that transition, it will be amazing. For example, in Sweden, they are having their first iron plant to make steel, fully based off hydrogen. They already are using that technology to use hydrogen to make steel, because they have like a big iron industry. And like those are the kinds of like then we need to look what can we learn from that? How can we also, because we in the Netherlands we also have like a big steel plant. How can we use hydrogen also for here in the Netherlands? Because then it can decrease the emissions that are like the toxic emissions that are produced around the burning of coal,
Right. Yes.
which is not really pleasant to be around.
No.
The burning of coal. It's an amazing power source, coal, but it's also bringing so much more negative impacts for everybody around it, and also for the environment, but mostly for the people around it, because it produces so much like gas emissions that are particles that you don't want to have actually.
You can utilize them too.
And then you can really utilize hydrogen as a really good energy source.
From that byproduct of what's going on in that area. Yeah. So I definitely agree. I also agree that hydrogen as a technology, we're still on uncharted territory, really. We're in the beginning of the development of the technology. And so I think the more we do with it and that's, I'm ebbing towards the question I want to ask next, which is, as you've mentioned, we can utilize hydrogen as an energy storage near production processes, which are still based in fossil fuels or in energy-intensive, carbon-intensive industry. And so I want to ask you, what do you think about the idea of approaching the topic of hydrogen with like a technology-neutral perspective? So would you think that exploring hydrogen's possibility also in its gray and blue aspects, which is, to all of those who don't know, hydrogen that's produced with the utilization of either fossil fuel associated processes or used by natural gas. There's also the question of pink hydrogen, which is created through hydrolysis from nuclear from the nuclear reaction of fission. And so what do you and there's also
the green hydrogen.
Yes.
And I think hydrogen on itself, it's a technology that it has great potential, but then you need to unlock this potential from hydrogen. So I think in the short period, yes, you are going to use hopefully mostly blue hydrogen, so that you produce hydrogen at plants, at production locations, where you can really capture all the CO2 emissions that are emitted by this production, that you really capture them and that you store them.
Right.
That's also, and then you catch like two interesting new technologies that are going on, like the carbon capture storage idea, like how can we really implement that? How does that work? That we really focus on that, and also with the use of the hydrogen. And I think we really should, like, green hydrogen is the end goal. That's what you want in the end. You want
renewable hydrogen,
abundant renewable energy that's left over, and you don't know, the energy system doesn't know what to do with. You want that you want to transform into hydrogen, but that's like the optimal end situation where you want to end it.
Right.
But before you get there, you cannot get all the industrial plants that are really energy intensive switching from coal or gas or oil immediately to the green hydrogen. We don't have enough green hydrogen at the moment.
And it's expensive to make it. It's
really
3 or 4 times more
really
expensive
to make it. So maybe already like switch the industrial production complexes already to hydrogen is really interesting. And then we can focus on using as much as blue and green and pink hydrogen for that production. And then you can also, if you're going to produce hydrogen with the gray method, you can also implement more filtering techniques to get less of the toxic gases out of the power of the plant to production of hydrogen. So and then you can also get it more concentrated, because the industrial complexes are more scattered out around an area or around different areas. And then if you make like the hydrogen, they are more selective. You can they are more concentrated in single places, because you make one big plant that's going to produce it, and then you can focus. Okay, there it is, and there we focus our attention on to reduce the emissions that are emitted by the power plant. You can have more filters, more cleaning air installations, and then it can really work. And then I think we can really should increase the investments that are being made in hydrogen and to transform our current industry. And then we can also keep the industry jobs inside Europe, because I think that's also quite
that's important.
It's important, and we should not forget it, that we have to be independent for our own technologies and our own production. We cannot. I think the current next 30 years, it's going to be more. You already see economies are more going to close off. That's more like a trend that's going on. Everybody needs to be self-sufficient, and I think for some technologies, some productions, you need to become self-sufficient. You need to produce them yourself. And I think in the European Union, we have 500 million people here. We have many skilled people, and then we are able to produce many things now. And then we should not waste those productions, like not push them out and then never forget about them. You should also help them in stimulating them to become green, to become sustainable, to also, because everybody has to come to the net zero in 2050. You also need to support the industries in that. We also need to look at that, like for the Polish regions. We also need to look how can those companies, those big businesses, who also become sustainable. And maybe then a bit of gray hydrogen is necessary, because you use less, you emit less CO2 in a hydrogen plant than in a normal industrial complex, maybe. And I think then you really should look at that. And then, of course, there's always a cost of investment, but there's always a cost of profit. Then there's also profit in the end also.
Definitely. And I think, as you said, I think it's important to utilize those different technologies, also because not limiting yourself to, well, first of all, there's the economic argument to be made that it's simply too expensive and too scarce of an asset, the green hydrogen, to utilize it on a wild scale as a hydrogen source of energy or energy storage. And so we should definitely explore a portfolio of those technologies so that we can better understand what hydrogen is, how it can be effectively utilized, and then we can also see what power, what usefulness it has for us as an asset towards in the process of decarbonization. So we talked about hydrogen, one element. I wanted to talk about another element, nitrogen. Also,
now we go to the important Dutch elections debate that are always going on, because we have a big abundance of nitrogen emitted by agricultural farms, especially cow and pig farms that are really producing a lot of emissions, of nitrogen emissions.
Right, Minister van der Wal.
Minister van der Wal she's Minister for Nitrogen,
and her government estimates say that, according to the proposal, the government proposal aims, this would likely lead to the closure, the nitrogen halving, or the reduction would lead to closure of 30% of livestock farms in the Netherlands.
Yes, true. Yeah, we have too much. The livestock is too much for what we can handle here in the Netherlands. If you see the numbers, we have 100 million chickens in this country. We have 30 million pigs, 20 million cows. We have more animals than people in this country.
Right.
And that's not sustainable. It's not. Nobody can really. It's not really helping to feed and have all these animals here in this country that are emitting so much nitrogen. That is really killing off the whole biodiversity of whole areas in the Netherlands. Like whole nature areas are turning gray. They are not really working anymore. They're over, like the biodiversity is gone in some areas. And then it's just as the overproduction of these animal products is also not really helping the whole situation here. And then because nitrogen is really affecting farmers mostly here, that is really also becoming like a really sensitive topic for the political, but also for the society, because we have to, according to if you just look at what's going on, we have too much hydrogen. How can we solve this? We have to reduce the amount of livestock that we have in the Netherlands. Some parties want to go as far as 50%. Some say we don't have to reduce it all, and then the minister found like a balance at 30% now, and that is necessary. But then we really should do that, and then over time we should decrease the amount of animals that we have that are emitting nitrogen, because otherwise the Netherlands is not really sustaining itself, and then the whole nature and the biodiversity is going to die, because then we just got one species of nature that's going to survive, that really like fossils
over
all the others.
Basically dominating the niche, the ecological niche in which it has been introduced, basically. While I see your point about not foregoing sustainability of the Netherlands, and in the larger scheme of things, aiming at the goals of greenhouse gas and reduction that go in line with the climate plans of the EU, isn't it poor timing considering the topic, the overarching topic on the basis of which we're talking today, which is the implementation of the European Green Deal in the aftermath of the Russo-Ukrainian war? Meaning, don't you think that the reduction of livestock and the reduction of first of all, it will inevitably be linked with a reduction in the supply of food and agro products. That might be, in my estimation, difficult and problematic given the radical decrease of grain, of fertilizer products that are in the market following the Russian aggression on Ukraine, given that both Russia and Ukraine are some of the largest producers of fertilizers and grain in the world. This might prove and it's already proving to be a problem for certain Northern African countries where food shortage is imminent. And there was a UN estimate that before the year 2030, roughly 100 million people will likely suffer from food insecurity, as it's been called. By the way, a very, very euphemistic term to use, food insecurity. So what I'm basically getting at is, don't you think that we should prioritize food production? And then, even though you're claiming that the Netherlands is producing too much, there's an excessive supply, but perhaps this can be used to mitigate the effects of the Russo-Ukrainian war on the food markets around the world, and can help balance that, and perhaps lowering the amount of livestock leading to the lowering of nitrogen. Perhaps lowering the amount of livestock would not be the most prudent maneuver right now, given that food oversupply is not the case everywhere, and that it might help.
No, I get your point that the Netherlands should not decrease its food production because of the lack of the food transported from Russia and Ukraine to North Africa. But also there's a the food that's produced in Russia and Ukraine is not the food that's produced here. What is produced in Ukraine and Russia is mostly grain, and they make fertilizers. But the thing that now is being produced in it is meat and dairy products. And then there's the question, the meat production is already, that could be sustainable, that could be good. But if you take away all the livestock, you're also generating meat, because when you kill an animal, you gain meat. That's the whole thing of an animal. And then the only short term, yeah. So then, if we kill a lot of animal, we also overfloat the market with food. So then we can solve the food crisis that's now going on in North Africa, because we have like a big bunch of livestock here in the Netherlands. And if we take away 30% of that livestock, we create meat out of it. We put the meat inside ships. We bring them to North Africa. Then they have food. And then the food scarce shortage is solved there in the short run.
In the short term, exactly.
And then, but can we?
I have a point to make to that.
But then the other thing is dairy products, and then dairy products is already decreasing over time. We have like products with oversupplying of milk and dairy products for such a long time in the whole of Europe already. Like the whole European policy was already created like overproducing milk because we really don't want food shortage anymore. But then everybody is like already, we all outcompete all the local farmers with our milk and food production.
Yeah, your farmers are amazingly efficient, but that's also partly the oversupply is partly a result of the cap mechanism.
Yeah.
So and we can argue that I think that's a topic for another discussion, how cap subsidies prioritize the European market and the prices of food products on agricultural markets, that leading to an artificial increase in supply. But okay, that the fact that you, by killing 30% of the livestock, you would produce short term a lot of material for consumption. Definitely, but there's a problem of storing that in the medium to long term. As you said yourself, it's a short-term solution, so it's not a sustainable, to use a buzzword, sustainable solution in the long term. And so this would probably address some of the problems, but then you would face a new problem, which is storing that meat so it's viable for consumption in a later phase. But I understand that might, as you can admit yourself that there is a dilemma of sorts.
But I think also the Netherlands, the food that's produced here is not really, it's not really what the market needs, not really what the international food market is asking for. It's asking for grain. And then what we can, we need to transform our country from just like animal livestock production to more to more agriculture, like agriculture, other products like plants.
Also, as I guess you're pertaining to. Yeah.
So if we have all those abundant lands because we stopped the livestock production there, then we can also farm grain, we can farm beans, we can farm other plants, vegetables that are more interesting for the international food market there. So would the whole situation
But it's a question whether the other markets have the luxury of choosing the produce that they consume. I mean, obviously, you're right in pointing out that the hypothetical oversupply of meat and its deployment, its exports to countries that suffer or will suffer from food insecurity, it will be a substitute, but not of the produce that is locally consumed. Well, the grain that's been exported out of Ukraine was also technical and used as not only as grain for consumption by humans, but as grain also by consumption animals. For livestock, exactly, True. Animals. And so that would definitely not be an ideal substitute, but then that would be something. But now, at least you would create a market for which where the meat could be sold at. And so buttressing the effects of food insecurity.
But now we're talking about when we talk about Ukrainian grain, for example, all the Eastern European countries, they are blocking transportation of grain through Poland, for example, to go to the Netherlands.
Yes,
for us to
that's
feed
very
food.
True. Yes,
that's also like agriculture policy is always really political. It's always really tangible, and how the whole farmer situation is in that country. And now, for example, in Poland, the Polish government is blocking transportation of Ukrainian food to support their own farmers.
That is true. Yes. Yeah.
And that it's always, and then there's also here the tension of really supporting your own farmers to push your own production, but then not looking in the broader picture. Like, is this really what the region or the economy of the whole world needs? Like, just because you are now the Polish farmers now profiting again because they can really sell their own products at a good price again, does this mean that the Ukrainian grain that's like oversupplied there, it cannot go away because all the harbors are being blocked by the Russian marine, and then it is really, really tricky to get all the Ukrainian grain outside of Ukraine and to bring it to Africa or bring it to the right people that need it.
Right.
And it's always really, really tricky for agriculture because agriculture is also really populistic, policies. And I think also in the Netherlands, for example, we had regional elections, and then the biggest party that became in the regional elections was just saying all the nitrogen policies, we're gonna abolish them. That was the only thing that was the whole main topic they campaigned upon.
Yes.
It was like nitrogen policies, they are terrible, they disrupt everything, they make these countries even worse. But then if you just look at what they are really wanting to do, it does not work in the long run. It does not go off. And you can produce so much milk, but if nobody wants to buy that milk, for who are you producing then?
Right, that's an oversupply then.
That's an oversupply.
By the nature of it. Yes.
And I think we also need to liberalize maybe a bit better how we are making our agriculture, because the whole agriculture business is really based upon subsidies. And so if we're already subsidizing the agriculture business, we maybe can also say, it's not really sustainable to have so many cows in this whole business. And maybe we should take away some of the livestock inside the agriculture complex and say, we don't need as many cows. Let's do less of them. And then it's hurting. It's not, people say it's hurting like local farmers, but we have like a fund of 24 billion euros available to buy out around 2,000 farmers here in the Netherlands.
Right. No, I mean, you've touched upon a lot of issues, and then obviously politics is a factor. It's a major factor. Poland blocking grain imports due to the losses of its farmers. Well, that's definitely a political decision. And then, although I've heard that Romania and Bulgaria are in talks with Ukraine, there's potentially some positive signals from Romania and Bulgaria. And then Slovakia, I've heard about organizing a way of making way for the exports there. But yes, I think it's fundamentally the question of timing right now, given the coincidence of many factors. First, the pandemic, then the war, inflation. So it's like 4 horsemen of apocalypse. It's true. And so then politically motivated lowered production of food products in a scenario where food security is at stake might not be a sustainable solution, at least in the medium term, because you know what I'm saying. It's sacrificing the poor to fulfill a political criterion, which in the long run, hypothetically, will aim at climate neutrality. But still,
I think if you look in the overrun, the poor are always being placed in the front line. We're always sacrificing the poor people. The poor people are never in no situation. The poor people are really benefiting from any of the changes they were going through. It's mostly always going for the worse for them. And we can forget about them and we can say, you don't matter. But I think what's really kind of important is also part of the transition is to make it just, to make it socially just, to make it also to really help people that are suffering from the hyperinflation, from the energy crisis, to help them with subsidy programs for more energy efficient buildings, for example. We really have to. I think that's something not to forget, because also the population in a democracy, everybody can vote. Everybody has like its own opinion. Everybody chooses what we are going to do in the next couple of years in a democracy and what your policies are going to be. So you need to take on everybody aboard. And I think it's really quite interesting how in the Netherlands, we have elections in 2 months' time. We have our big lord, Frans Timmermans, is coming back. He's coming to the Netherlands to save this country from all the mishaps that happened on the different liberal governments that we had. And I think it will be quite interesting how that will work out, because if you look at the polls now, they are or first or second in the polls. What if he becomes the new prime minister of the Netherlands? How will policies change then? What will happen? How will we set the new targets for this country? And I think this will be an interesting time to be alive and to see what is going to happen here in this country and how things will change. And if he is elected, how will we deal with new policies? For example, we also have a big discussion about fossil fuel subsidies. According to an economic calculation, we are subsidizing fossil fuels 37 billion euros per year by the government in reduction in tax exemptions for fossil fuels, big energy power plants that have like nice, really subsidy plans for them. So there's a big amount, like the financial framework and the policy framework should be the promotion and the incentive for renewables and and the deduction and the decrease of fossil fuel use. That should be like disincentivized. And currently that's really big going on. And then I think it would be interesting how to solve that. And then we also have the farmers that are still a big, loud political voice here in the Netherlands. Like, they're also divided inside themselves. Like inside the whole farmer community, you have sort of two sides. You have more like the old. They are unionized, unionized via their representative organizations. And you have like the more old people, the old farmers organization. They were really against all the nitrogen rules. They were always like stamping their feet on the ground and really shouting, no, we don't want to do it. And they were like blocking the highways and
engaging in interruptions of
interruptions.
life,
and then you also had the younger generation, the young representations farmers. They were really like, yeah, we see this. In the last 70 years, we did things wrong. We really want to have like the new way of farming. We really want to go for it. We want to farm. We are proud to be farmers. But then those group, because they were young, they didn't have like the whole political capital behind them. They really got overshadowed by this whole big group that is supported by this way of doing it. Like the whole system was like, we don't want to change. And then I think sometimes also in democracies, the person who shouts the loudest, like,
not always right.
It's not always right, but people think
unless it's the Dutch farmers, which I'm not saying are all the way right, but when you face a portion of the population which has engineered the most efficient farming system in the world in terms of yield per hectare, basically, I think it's prudent for politicians and policymakers not to fall into that attitude of kind of, oh yes, these are farmers, these are troublemakers, because surely they have interrupted the civil discourse and the social life here in the Netherlands. However, given their multi-generational wisdom and expertise in what they're doing, I think it's prudent to also for them to have a say, and perhaps there can be a solution that could kind of make both of the parties have the cake and eat it too.
Yeah, that's like a solution where we're almost there. That we had like a new agriculture agreement for how do we want to see agriculture for the Netherlands to 2050, for the next 30 years. And then at the last moment, the farmers organization, they stepped out of the whole agreement. They said they were 95% they were done with the talks. It was just like small things they were still discussing. And then at the last point they said, no, we don't want to support this at all. We are going away. And then the whole agreement failed, and we were almost there. It took us 2 years of discussions, and then the farmers got like a really, really good deal for themselves, with like transformation, like the using the wisdom, having like plans per region. How are we going to deal with this situation? How are we making sure that nobody will get really big negatively affected by the whole new phase? And then at the last point, they really only thought about themselves again. It's like, no, we don't want to do this. We don't want to work together. We want to be egoistic. And then they just stepped out. And then it also does not work for them in the long run. They should have stepped back at the table like immediately.
So you think the oversupply of their produce is going to prove problematic for them as well?
Yeah. That's already a big thing, because with the oversupply, the small farmers are not able, because to oversupply the prices are so low, you need to also be really, really cost effective to reach like the low price level. Right. And to be cost effective, you need the economies of scale. So you need to become a really big farmer. So you need at least 1,000 cows now. That's always how they calculate it. Like how many cows, how cost effective can you be? Because if you have 1,000 cows, you get like a really big hole where you can put them all. You can buy the newest technology, you can buy the newest machines, and you can decrease your cost massively. Then there's always the the ideological view of this 60 cow farmer, who was just like a small,
Right.
like one person, who was just on his tractor, who is just going with his cows. But then those big farmers, they all outcompete the small country farmers.
Well, yes. Mm-hmm.
And then only now at some point we only have the big farmers that are left. All the small farmers are just outcompeted, and then they had to do something else because they all were bankrupt. They all went bankrupt. That was a big thing. Like the amount of farmers that we have in the Netherlands, it's already half than it was 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like it goes half every 10
Generation.
every generation, because nobody can really sustain this whole like pushing for like the maximum, most efficient, most profitable
Supply of
supply, and then
increase of the supply, right?
And then the farmers, they want to continue the situation, but they're already going to come out competed by the neighbor, because then the neighbor got a new technology, and you were not, and the old farmer was not able to get it, and then you will go
Right.
bankrupt. So it was more interesting to have like a situation where you have like, okay, we're going to do this all together, and we have this more idea of like, we're going to plan this like this, and then have like the laissez-faire
Right.
economy approach. Say, well, the winner takes all, and the loser can stay away, because that's what, if you calculate the Farmers Party, they also made a program for the next 5 years, like a election program. It was calculated, and then according to the program, half of the farmers are going bankrupt, because the small farmers are not going to sustain with this system, because
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to be profitable.
Right.
And only the big farmers are going to be profitable. And then already half of them are going bankrupt, and everybody knows it. But then the political leader of the party says, "No, I don't believe the calculations. I don't want to." Then now she has like a whole big campaign. I don't want my political program to be calculated by economists, because economists are always wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to feel my program and understand it, and then you know my program is good. She doesn't want any numbers in the whole, like the whole number section of her political program is ripped out. She didn't want it because it showed such a bad figure for the farmers.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's an interesting time, and it really something has to happen like in the next 5 years on this topic. So I think maybe the farmers will see it for themselves. This is not a sustainable way to go for the future. But
Right.
we will see.
We'll see. As we're coming to an end of our time, I would just ask you one last question that would, I hope, prove to be a nice compositional element for our conversation. Sort of a nice crescendo at the end, which is, what do you think the Russian sanctions, do they prove to be a problem long-term or an opportunity for the development and indeed the bringing about of the goals of the European Green Deal?
For the long term, really big opportunity. It creates so much positive incentives for the whole European Union and for everybody to become more sustainable and more environmentally friendly and less dependent on fossil fuels. So I think the Russian, if you look at it in the long run and you see all the hiccups that we had in the gas prices, in the oil prices, in the coal prices, you can see that I think we saw this as an opportunity to grasp it and really decrease the fossil fuels that we use in our system. And I think maybe it's really wrong to say, but maybe for the energy system it was actually good that we had this. So to give this extra push for sustainability and renewables. So I think in the long run it's really positive.
And on that note, Youri, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time for this conversation. And we wish to have you once again at our podcast at some time in the future. And to all of the listeners, first of all, thank you very much for listening. Dziękujemy bardzo Państwu za wysłuchanie tego odcinka i zapraszamy do wysłuchania i obejrzenia kolejnych webinariów i podcastów w serii Green Talks. Dziękuję.